Well, there I was not knowing how to start this video, and then I sat on my chair and snapped it. So let's talk about monsters. Without a shadow of a doubt, the most satisfying and rewarding thing about being a dungeon master or game master is giving your players an experience that they'll continue to talk about for years to come. I personally love nothing more than reminiscing with my players about sessions that happened several years ago that still act as core shared memories between all of us. It's kind of like an exclusive Hollywood blockbuster that only we got to experience, so why wouldn't you want those experiences to be as unique and memorable as possible? I found that a majority of the time, the most reoccurring themes we continue to talk about primarily revolve around fun and unique combat encounters that my players lived to tell a tale about. Thanks to the monster manual alone, you've already got 300 plus monsters you can throw at your players, and then when you factor in other online or third-party monster bestiaries, there's kind of bestiaries? More monsters, there's thousands of them. I actually find it terrifyingly intimidating trying to narrow down what monster to throw at my players because I never quite know what experience they'll resonate with the most on any given day. Some days they'll want to hit things, some days they'll want to talk it out, and other days they want to be challenged by means that aren't directly related to fighting something. For my playgroup at least, I find that creatures that have more unconventional mechanics are the ones that resonate the most with them, especially when they stretch out longer than just the combat itself. Either that, or creatures that also have an emphasis on narrative or roleplay elements as well. And I think that's simply because it adds more layers and emotional resonance to the experience. With all of this in mind, it had me thinking, throughout the several thousand monsters that I have at my disposal and have run in the past, what monsters make up for the most memorable and fun encounter? Let's set the scene a little bit. As dusk settles over the quiet village, a welcoming glow spills from the windows of a small, unassuming inn at the edge of town. The sign above the door creaks softly in the breeze, inviting weary travelers with promises of warm beds and hearty meals. Inside, the fire crackles, and a soft, comforting warmth fills the air, chasing away the evening chill. The innkeeper, a kindly grey-haired woman, smiles at you as you step through the door, her gaze lingering just a moment too long. She shows you to a cozy room, with walls adorned by faded tapestries and a bed dressed in thickened blankets. The scents of lavender and honey linger in the air, lulling you into a sense of ease. Yet, as the night deepens, an unsettling stillness creeps through the inn. The gentle hum of conversation fades, replaced by a distant, almost musical whisper that weaves through your dreams, drawing you further and further into sleep's embrace. What you don't realize is beneath the inn's homely charm lies a darker truth. The kindly innkeeper and her companions are not as they appear. Their pleasant faces mask the magical, twisted forms of dusk hags, who feast not on flesh, but on dreams. Hidden behind illusions, they bide their time, feeding on the nightmares of those who sleep beneath their roof, their powers growing with each dream they devour. And so the travellers rest easy, unaware that in the morning they will not only leave their coin behind, but a part of themselves as well. Welcome, adventurer, to the Hag's Coven. Fantastic. I was painting before this, so let's temporarily use this paintbrush as a microphone arm. If you haven't had the pleasure of experiencing the truly unsettling nature of an effective coven of hags, point your DM specifically to this part of the video, because in the close to a dozen experiences I've had with hags throughout my years of D&D, they stick out as one of the most memorable and customizable D&D encounters one can have. And this is primarily because there's so many variations of hags themselves, and ways in which you can deceive your players into a false sense of security with a group of seemingly lovely looking elderly women who actually aren't, because they kind of never are. There's always something else going on. If you're not at all familiar with the concept of a hag, they're essentially horrible witches or dark fae that haunt the waking days and nightmares of anyone they come in contact with. If you've seen the old, stereotypes of a crone over a cauldron, it's that kind of vibe, but they're typically a lot more unappealing to the eye. Mechanically, the stat blocks of individual hags probably don't seem all that exciting, because they're not at all. But once you introduce the idea of a coven and a hag lair, the excitement of a combat encounter gets a lot more dangerous and unsettling, as essentially they all remain within close proximity of one another, they get access to an expanded spell list, more dangerous spells, and just generally become much more scary. The base monster manual does a fine job at proposing what these kind of spells are, but I've always liked additionally expanding upon this list to make my hag coven feel more aesthetic to whatever environment I'm trying to run. Volo's Guide to Monsters also has some really fantastic examples of this, like I think there's Radiant spell lists and Nature spell lists, so if you want that kind of hag coven, go there. Stat blocks aside, for me, it's the environment and nature in which you introduce your players to the Coven of Hags that makes the entire encounter memorable. For example, my first encounter with hags was when I was playing through Curse of Strahd, in which Coven of 3 night hags disguise themselves as a fairly innocent family of pastry sellers. For a more experienced or just generally intelligent player, they might have been able to pick up on some of the more obvious clues that were scattered about throughout this coven, but for me, I spent a horrific amount of time chasing errands for these women and assisting them until I inadvertently uncovered that they were using the bone dust of children to make their pies. Not very cool. I also think that partially because of my love of Witcher 3 and the hags that are present in that arc of the storyline, it's just very aesthetically in my area, like in my wheelhouse. What am I trying to say? It tickles my fancy. Let's just cut that. Sure, hags are all well and good, but let's pop on down to the Shadowfell for a minute. As you step further into the Shadowfell, the oppressive gloom wraps around you, swallowing the faint light from your torches. The air is thick and stale, a silence so profound that even your own footsteps seem to vanish before reaching your ears. But then, as if by some trick of fate, a gentle glow appears ahead, piercing the darkness with an impossible warmth. The light reveals a wide expanse, its walls lined with rich tapestries and polished stone. At the center, a lush meadow stretches out, vivid with blooming flowers and the soft murmur of a bubbling brook. Behind this, you can make out a welcoming homestead with lanterns swinging on doorposts and the distant sound of what you can only assume to be laughter. Yet, as you draw nearer, something feels wrong. The scent of fresh grass and warm bread is tinged with something foul and metallic, a subtle undercurrent that tugs at the edge of your mind. What seems like reality begins to waver, and a faint ripple distorts the idyllic scene. What you don't see, concealed within the gloom above, a Belhanath clings to the rock, weaving this illusion with patient malice, its tentacles poised to strike the moment you let your guard down. The perfect refuge you find yourself in was nothing more than a mirage, a sinister lure in the endless Shadowfell. The creative freedom you have in setting the scene for a Belhanath encounter is without a doubt the most enticing thing about them, and if you're not sure what creative freedoms I'm referring to, allow me to dive straight in. Belhanaths have the capability of telepathically reading other creatures' minds, which they then use to reach out towards said creatures within 1 mile. And the purpose of this mind reading is learning whenever your players desire most. Perhaps it's simply a warm and safe shelter to finally catch up on an overdue long rest. Or instead, maybe one of your party members has led this expedition into the Shadowfell in search of someone deeply interconnected with their backstory. From here, the Belhanath will use this information in tandem with their reality warping abilities to make their lair resemble exactly what the individual they targeted desired. So if you're not reading between all of the lines here, the best part of all of that is you really get to tug at your players' heartstrings a little bit by baiting them into a very unsuspecting trap that means something to them and their character's backstory, which is always nice. It also comes with the consequence that when they inevitably unearth the true nature of the situation that they're in, it's a lot more emotionally devastating. But we as DMs are constantly emotionally devastated, so it's about damn time. Once you have successfully lured your players in, the real fun begins. Because when it comes to Belhanaths in combat, they're ambush predators that can make themselves invisible within their own illusions that also have some terrifying abilities and lair actions as well. The scarier part of them in combat when your players don't realize that they're in combat is they typically attack targets in isolation by biting with their large jagged mouths or grappling and constricting them with their tentacles. And the scary part is the grappling, because when somebody is grappled by one of the tentacles, they're rendered incapable of casting spells or using magical properties of magical items, so if they target a spellcaster and successfully grapple them, they really can't do much. This gets even more terrifying when you factor in the fact that Belhanaths can additionally teleport with somebody that they've got targeted, so if they somehow secretly grab your spellcaster and teleport away and go invisible, potentially bye-bye spellcaster? This may seem a little bit overpowered if the Belhanath can just create an entire mirage and tap into your players' desires and then go invisible and pick them off one by one, but it's actually relatively easy to uncover the true nature of their surroundings, and I've always found that anything that seems too good to be true to my players actually instinctively tends to be, so they're always over-investigating. And I suppose if they don't bother to look into things a bit and just believe this entire falsehood until each and every player is picked off one by one, it makes for a good story, so you're welcome. Time for a quick sponsored segment. Hey Hey, buddy bud, what you doing?
Well, isn't it obvious? I completely forgot to prepare for today's one-shot, and my players are going to arrive in 52 minutes. That's impossible!
Not at all, actually. Just use Tales of Fablecraft.
I don't even have time to comprehend what you're talking about.
By the sounds of it, it's exactly what you need. A virtual tabletop RPG that has multiple pre-written adventures ready to go that barely require any preparation.
Look, that's great and all, but I'm not interested in running another reskinned D&D starting adventure.
Well, that's kind of the thing. It's not D&D. It uses its own D6 system that's entirely focused around accessibility.
Well, what else does it do?
Well, for still being in early access, a scary amount. For one, combat plays out like an incredibly visual and animated turn-based strategy game.
That's stunning.
And then, on top of that, you can utilize an abundance of animated artwork and music with really simplistic controls to further enrich the story that you're trying to tell.
Well, it would have been nice if you told me this 4 hours ago.
Let's get a bit more slimy. No, we're not using that. Cut that. The town of Mirefield sits nested at the edge of a sprawling swamp, where mist coils around the gnarled trees and stagnant pools reflect the grey sky above. Life here has always been slow, but recently an unnatural stillness has crept in. Familiar faces seem distant, conversations feel hollow, and there's a strange sweet scent in the air that lingers like an unwanted memory. Villagers go about their days with glazed eyes and weary steps, as if weighed down by something unseen. Friends and neighbours stand just a bit too close, their smiles stretched too wide, and the voices carry an unsettling mimicry of warmth. Yet, no one can place when the changes began, or why they feel so alone amidst the crowd. Unbeknownst to the townsfolk of Mirefield, an outer obelisk has slithered its way into their midst. In hidden corners and forgotten alleyways, it pulls people aside, draining their thoughts, their lives, until only an empty husk remains. Friends and loved ones vanish, replaced by false echoes, while the obelisk expands its insidious grip, feeding on the town's memories, one soul at a time. Let's just get stupid for a second. What could be more terrifying than replacing one of your party members with a carbon copy of themselves that they're not even aware of? The correct answer is the Mothman, but we're not talking about that right now. To effectively run an obelisk, you first have to understand what they are. To keep it short and sweet, they're essentially giant, intelligent oozes that were created by mind flayers that feed on other creatures' memories. The only caveat with all of that is because they serve their creators, which are the Illithids and the mind flayers, they have the ability of providing everything necessary for the mind flayers to find choice victims because they're consuming all of that knowledge and passing it directly onto them. As touched on earlier, the scariest and best part of an obelisk is that they're capable of using these memories to create exact replicas of their victims, not in memory sense, like they can ooze out a direct copy of you if they've harvested your memories, which is disgusting, but also very cool. You might be asking yourself, what's the point of creating these replicas? And that's primarily to trick the people who aren't duplicated as of yet into a false sense of safety so that the obelisk can continue to feed on them. Isn't that just sick? Like, cool sick, but also sick and creepy. Here, imagine a situation where your players come to discover that a few of their beloved NPCs have been replaced with copies of themselves for God knows how long and have essentially been doing quests directly for the Mind Flayers. That's like a whole story arc that you can just go use, have fun with it. It's an important caveat to note that it's not specifically stated anywhere that obelisks actually need to consume the individual that they're harvesting their memories from. In fact, I think they only need them for a few mere moments. They kind of give me some of those memories, you're good to go, and they kind of have amnesia for a little bit, but I don't think that's as cool. Now, that doesn't mean I just have every obelisk I run kill the individual they consume the memories of, but from what I've read, obelisks are driven towards intelligent, intellectual kind of figures, like spellcasters, for example. So you could do something along the lines of the following. Perhaps those with deeply intellectual and worthwhile memories are transported to something like a mind flare colony, so they can continue being harvested. And then on the inverse, those who are a waste of space in the Illithid's grand scheme of things are disposed of. I mean, on the inverse of all of this, you could go down a completely different route and have a somewhat neutral obelisk that quite openly consumes the negative memories of everyone in town, making them all incredibly pleasant. Just think of a town full of Ned Flander types governed by an ooze. Whichever way you decide to go with it, if your players decide to intervene with the true nature of said obelisk, combat makes for an entertaining and potentially never-ending occurrence. And this is primarily because if your players get the upper hand, the Oblex can just dimension door their way out of combat, only to return to the campaign at a later date and location. And hey, who knows, by the 40th session of your campaign, the entire fictitious content that your players inhabit might be only populated by Oblex spawns. Now isn't that grim? Speaking of grim, this one is probably my favorite. The town of Willow's Rest is a quiet place, nestled in a lush valley where the river runs clear and the hills are soft with wildflowers. The cobblestone streets wind past cheerful cottages, each with their own painted door and smoke curling from their chimneys. People go about their daily routines with an eerie calm, chatting with familiar faces, yet an odd stillness still lingers. There's a strange emptiness in the air, as if something precious has been stolen, yet no one seems to notice. In the town square, the fountain gurgles, but fewer voices fill the streets. You find yourself wondering how many faces you saw yesterday that you don't see today. Strangely, no one speaks of those who have gone missing. The townsfolk almost seem oblivious, their minds seemingly dulled, like a half-forgotten dream slipping away. The buildings, although well kept, feel as though they're holding their breath, quiet witnesses to a horror just below the surface. If one were to listen closely, beneath the familiar hum of daily life, a low haunting melody drifts through the air. It's barely audible, a whisper at the edge of perception, woven into the very fabric of the town. As night falls, the feeling of unease grows, but no one speaks of it, for the town itself is under a spell. The spell of a false hydra. I live for false hydras, primarily because of how incredible of a role-playing encounter they are. And if you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, buckle up and allow me to enlighten you. False hydras in their simplest form are quite similar to hydras because no shit, Sherlock. But unlike a regular hydra, it has a terrifying and unique ability in that it can sing a magical song that makes people forget about its existence or visibility, or the existence of anyone that it's consumed. For you see, when a false hydra moves into a town, it hides underground and starts up its song, and for anyone within range, they fall under its spell. As it continues to devour people, the townsfolk have no memory of those missing, and they don't actually even realize that they're gone. Their entire existence is just erased from people's memory. To add to all of this fun, the creature continues growing more and more heads the more that it feeds, which amplifies the radius of its song, making it harder and harder to remember what's happening and continuing this terrifying death cycle. It's an incredibly cool and unique premise, but it's also a very hard creature to implement properly because of the complexity of them, but if you can manage to pull it off, my god is it satisfying. So, to help you achieve that, here's a little cheat sheet on how to run them effectively. The first and only tip, make super obvious clues. This may sound like it would negatively impact the entire experience, but these clues won't reveal themselves as clues until your party are well and truly under the spell of the Hydra, so the more the merrier. For example, have the NPCs of your town describe their own town as haunted in a sense, with no evidence of ghosts. Maybe have some of the more talkative NPCs, like your innkeepers, constantly pointing out that there's always some form of kids pulling pranks by going into abandoned homes and lighting candles, or staging dinner settings where no one's eaten any food. Perhaps one of your players wants to do a perception check on an NPC that they meet for the first time, so make sure to highlight details that maybe in the past you would have glossed over, like a wedding ring or a clearly visible name tattooed on their skin. Why would any of those things matter? Well, perhaps your players ask about said wedding ring, and then the NPC says, "I've never been married." All of these things will start to raise suspicion in your players, which you can then further intertwine with webs of truth in various forms. Perhaps one of your players chooses to investigate one of these abandoned homes and discovers a journal entry of an elderly woman who kept more and more thorough notes in her later years in life as she lost all form of hearing. The deeper into the journal they get, her notes start to detail a giant, monstrous creature with multiple heads of some form that sits quite literally in the middle of town for all to see, but nobody acknowledges it except for her. And as they continue to the last few pages of the journal, they suddenly stop halfway through a sentence. I probably should have said, if you can drown out the sound of the False Hydra's song, you can uncover their true presence. In my opinion, the joy of uncovering the truth of a False Hydra is the most rewarding and memorable part of them, but there's also a nifty homebrewed stat block that you can use with some cool legendary actions, so the full bundle is there, just throw it at your players. I just adore these kind of creatures that can shape genuinely an entire town in whatever campaign setting you're running. It's like a much more exciting serial killer to try and catch when you aren't even aware that there's a serial killer to begin with. We're out of creativity, let's just stick with a pencil. I could honestly go on and on about some of the other amazing monsters that are in Flea Mortals, or any of the half to nearly dozen monster manuals I've collected at this point, but maybe I'll do a spooky one to wrap up the end of Halloween. I think that's a good idea. Also, I'm always on the lookout for more memorable monster designs, so if you've got any recommendations of your own, be sure to let me know in the comments, and if you disagree on anything that I've covered off in the video, please don't tell me I'm very sensitive. I'm joking, you can do whatever you want.